The letter was in her coat pocket when the train pulled into Mercer Flats, and Eleanor Marsh had read it so many times during the 3-day journey from Philadelphia that the paper had gone soft at the folds. She read it once more as the brakes screamed, and the platform slid into view through the frost-edged window. Hopping, the words might have rearranged themselves into something less catastrophic while she wasn't looking. They hadn't. Miss Marsh, I write this with considerable regret and no small amount of shame. Circumstances have changed in ways I cannot fully explain by letter. I have taken a position in Oregon and departed Mercer Flats as of Tuesday last. Please do not make the journey. I am deeply sorry. G. Holt. Deeply sorry. Eleanor folded the letter along its worn creases and tucked it back into her pocket. Gerald Holt was deeply sorry, and she was stepping off a train in a Montana town she had never seen in November with one trunk, $40, and a return ticket she could not afford to use. The platform was narrow and cold, the wind coming off the mountains with a particular cruelty that Philadelphia wind never bothered with. Eleanor stood beside her trunk and watched the other passengers disperse toward wagons and waiting families, pulling her coat tighter and permitting herself exactly 30 seconds of pure, silent panic. She counted them out. Then she stopped. She was 25 years old. She had survived her father's death at 16, her mother's long illness at 19, and 4 years of teaching 40 children in a drafty schoolroom on Clement Street. She could survive a train platform in Montana. What she could not immediately determine was what came next. The $40 would last perhaps 6 weeks at a boarding house, assuming Mercer Flats had one. She had skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, basic French, piano, none of which appeared immediately useful on a frontier platform surrounded by men in canvas coats who were studiously not looking at the woman in the traveling suit standing alone beside a trunk. She had no family to wire. She had no plan. She was still constructing one when the voice came from her left. "You're the woman Gerald Holt sent for." It was not a question. Eleanor turned. The man standing 10 feet away was tall and lean in the particular way of men who work outdoors in all weather. His face weathered to a kind of permanent squint, dark hair going gray at the temples. He wore a rancher's clothes, heavy canvas, worn leather, boots that had seen genuine use, and he held his hat in both hands in front of him, which she would later understand was as close as Thomas Calloway came to ceremony. Flanking him, pressed against his legs with the territorial instinct of small animals, were 2 boys. Identical, red-cheeked and dark-haired, perhaps 7 years old, both watching her with the frank and merciless attention that children reserve for things they have not yet decided about. "I am," Eleanor said carefully, "though the situation has apparently changed." "Gerald's gone to Oregon." Thomas Calloway nodded as though confirming something he'd already known. "Heard it 3 days ago. Figured you might not get word in time." He paused. "I'm Thomas Calloway. I run a cattle operation about 4 miles west of town. These are my sons, Charlie and Will." The boy on the left raised his hand. "I'm Charlie." "He's Will," said the boy on the right immediately. "I'm Charlie," the first one repeated, with the patience of someone who had been through this before. Eleanor looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the sky briefly, in the manner of a man petitioning something larger than himself. "They do that," he said. "Ignore it mostly." "We heard you were coming," the boy who claimed to be Charlie continued. "Papa said you were a teacher." "I am a teacher." "Can you do sums?" the other one asked. "I can." "Papa can't," Charlie said. "I can do sums," Thomas said, with quiet dignity. "Not fast ones," Will said. Eleanor felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not hope exactly, but the first cousin of it. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "what is it you actually want to say to me?" He looked at her directly then, and she saw that his eyes were gray, and that there was something in them that was not pity and not calculation, but something more careful than either. "I want to say that I have 2 boys who haven't had proper schooling in over a year, and a ranch house that runs better with more than one adult in it, and I'm not asking you to do anything improper. My cook Agnes has been with us 8 years. She'd chaperone. You'd have your own room, meals, and $25 a month." He stopped. 2 weeks. You try it 2 weeks. If it doesn't suit, I'll put you on the eastbound train myself and cover the fare. You have my word on it. Alina looked at the platform. She looked at her trunk. She looked at the two boys, who were now engaged in a whispered argument about something she couldn't quite hear, their heads bent together like two halves of the same thought. She looked at Thomas Calloway, who was still holding his hat and waiting with the stillness of a man who understood that pushing would not help. "What happened to their mother?" she asked. Something moved through his face and settled. "Fever, 18 months ago." Alina picked up her smaller bag. "I'll need my trunk loaded." Calloway Ranch appeared at the end of a rutted track through grassland gone gold and flat in the November cold. A 2-story log house with a stone chimney at each end, and a porch that ran the full width of the front. Smoke from the left chimney. Amber light in the lower windows. As Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop, the front door opened, and a woman appeared in it like a person who had been waiting specifically to disapprove of something. Agnes Prout was perhaps 58, short and broad, with iron-gray hair and the expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the foolishness of other people. She looked at Alina the way a customs inspector looks at luggage. Then she looked at Thomas. "You brought her home," Agnes said. It was not quite an accusation. She had nowhere else to go. "I can speak for myself," Alina said pleasantly, climbing down from the wagon before Thomas could offer to help. "I'm Alina Marsh. I've been offered a 2-week trial as governess to your boys. I have experience teaching. I won't complain about the cold, and I make my own bed." She paused. "I also have no intention of being in anyone's way." Agnes studied her for a long moment. "$25 a month," she said finally. "That's what Mr. Calloway offered, yes." "30, Agnes said, looking at Thomas now. "She'll be teaching and helping run the house. 30, or I'll tell Reverend Aldous about the time you fell asleep during his sermon and snored loud enough to wake the Hendersons." "That was one time," Thomas said, "and it was a very long sermon." Agnes raised one eyebrow. $30, Thomas said. Agnes nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had never doubted the outcome. She turned back to Alina. "Your room's at the end of the hall. Supper's in 20 minutes. The boys have already eaten, but they'll try to convince you they haven't." She turned and walked back inside. "Wipe your boots," she added, to all of them and no one. Alina's room was small and clean, with a whitewashed wall, a brass bed, a good quilt in shades of blue and cream, and a window that looked west toward mountains she couldn't see in the dark but could feel, the way you can feel a large thing nearby even without seeing it. Someone had put a candle on the windowsill and left it lit. She stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed. It was not what she had planned, but it was a room that was hers, at least for 2 weeks, and it smelled of pine wood and candle wax, and through the wall she could hear the boys arguing in the next room with the comfortable heat of an argument neither of them intended to resolve. The twins came for her at breakfast the following morning, with the coordinated aggression of a cavalry unit. "Our last teacher quit," Charlie announced, settling across from her at the kitchen table. "She said we were impossible," Will added cheerfully. "We're not impossible," Charlie said. "We're just a lot," Will finished. "I was going to say spirited." "She cried," Will said, "twice." Alina poured her coffee. "I don't cry," she said. "I'm from Philadelphia." The boys exchanged a glance. She had, apparently, said something impressive without meaning to. The morning's lessons revealed what she had expected: 2 bright boys with large gaps where consistency had been absent. Their reading was adequate but joyless, learned by rote and never for pleasure. Their arithmetic was sharp in ways that suggested they'd been counting cattle and calculating feed weights since they could walk, but formal mathematics left them cold. They fidgeted. They interrupted. Charlie corrected Will's spelling, and Will corrected Charlie's corrections, and both of them were usually half right, which was somehow more aggravating than being entirely wrong. But they were not impossible. They were hungry, in the way that children are hungry when no one has thought to feed a particular part of them in a while. That afternoon, Alina found a novel on the shelf in the small room Thomas used for accounts, a battered copy of a sea adventure, the kind of book that had no educational virtue whatsoever and was therefore exactly right. She sat the boys down after their lessons and read aloud for 40 minutes without stopping, doing the voices badly enough to be funny and well enough to be real. And when she closed the book, both boys sat still for a full 4 seconds before Charlie said, "What happens next?" And Will said, "She already stopped, obviously." And Charlie said, "I know, I was asking about next time," and Will said, "Oh," and then they both looked at Alina with an expression she recognized. She had seen it in Philadelphia, in 38 different faces. It was the expression of a child who has just discovered that reading can be something that happens to you. She looked up and found Thomas in the doorway. She didn't know how long he had been there. His expression was the careful blank of a man holding something too full to move quickly. He said nothing. After a moment he turned and walked back down the hall, his boots quiet on the wood floor. Catherine Calloway was everywhere in the house without being anywhere specific. A rocking chair by the east window that no one sat in. The particular way the boys said please and thank you, correct, instinctive, clearly taught young and taught well. A small watercolor of the mountains on the kitchen wall, initialed CC in the lower corner. Thomas's habit of pausing in the kitchen doorway every morning as though checking for something he no longer expected to find. Alina did not move the rocking chair. She did not rearrange anything. She simply worked around it all, the way you work around furniture in an unfamiliar room, carefully, respectfully, learning the shape of the life that had been lived here before her. Sunday arrived with clear cold and the collective expectation of Mercer Flats, which turned out to be smaller than Alina had imagined and more attentive than she had hoped. The church held perhaps 60 people, and she felt the awareness of all 60 the moment she walked in beside Thomas, the boys already ahead of them and arguing about which pew constituted their traditional pew. The whispers were not subtle, "That's her. Gerald Holt's woman. Poor thing. Thomas Calloway brought her home, did you hear?" She kept her eyes forward and her chin at a height that communicated nothing except composure. After the service, in the cold outside, a woman named Vera Dodd approached. She was perhaps 60, built like someone who had spent 40 years not being pushed around by Montana winters, and she looked Alina over with the frank efficiency of a woman who had raised 7 children and had no time remaining for anything indirect. "You're the Philadelphia girl," Vera said. "I'm Alina Marsh," Alina said. "Gerald Holt's a fool, always has been." Vera said it the way she might say the creek runs north as established fact. 3 women before you, never had the spine to say no before they bought their tickets. She tilted her head. "You teaching those Calloway boys?" "Trying to." "Trying or doing?" Alina considered. "Doing," she said, with some resistance. Something shifted in Vera Dodd's face, not quite a smile, but the infrastructure of one. "Those boys need someone who doesn't fold," she said. "Their mother didn't fold." She paused, and her voice changed register slightly, the way voices do when they shift from assessment to something more honest. "Catherine was a good woman. You're not replacing her. Nobody expects that. But those children need steadiness, and so does that man, whether he knows how to say it or not." Before Alina could respond, another woman nearby said something cutting about mail-order women and their expectations, and Vera Dodd turned toward the sound with the deliberate unhurry of someone who has been waiting for an excuse. "Margaret Ellers," Vera said pleasantly, "when you have raised 2 motherless boys through a Montana winter without a word of complaint and held a grieving man's household together with nothing but your own good sense, you may have opinions about Alina Marsh. Until then, perhaps take that up with Reverend Aldous." She turned back to Alina. "Come to supper Thursday. I'll introduce you to the women worth knowing." Thomas rode the fence line every Wednesday, checking for winter damage, and the Wednesday after the church service he asked Alina if she rode. She told him she had learned at 16 and not practiced since. He saddled a gentle gray mare named Opal without comment, and they rode out together in the late morning, the boys at their lessons with Agnes keeping a loose and skeptical eye. The land was immense in a way that Alina still had not adjusted to. In Philadelphia, the sky was something that happened between buildings. Here it was the main event, a pale winter blue from edge to edge, and the mountains to the west were so large and so still they seemed painted rather than real. Thomas talked about Catherine the way he talked about the ranch factually, with deep care underneath the facts. She had come from a family in Billings. She had hated the first winter and loved everyone after. She sang while she worked, always slightly off-key, and had considered this irrelevant. She had taught the boys to read herself, sitting with one on each knee, before she got sick. She was the kind of person, Thomas said, looking at the fence line rather than Alina, who made everything around her more ordered just by being in it. Not by trying to, just by being. Alina was quiet for a moment. My mother was like that, she said. I always felt like I was borrowing her competence, like without her nearby I was improvising. Are you still improvising? She thought about the last 2 weeks. The lessons, the boys, Agnes's gruff and growing warmth, the rocking chair she hadn't moved, the window light in her room every morning. Less than I was, she said. Thomas nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he'd been uncertain about. They rode the rest of the fence line without talking much, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have stopped performing for each other. The letter from the territorial school board in Helena arrived on a Thursday, addressed in formal copperplate to Miss Alina Marsh, care of Cowboy Ranch. Agnes carried it in from the post without comment and set it on the kitchen table where Alina was correcting the boys' arithmetic. The offer was substantial, $60 a month, a room with a family in Helena, 30 students, official certification from the territory. It was everything a woman in her position was supposed to want: security, status, a future that didn't depend on anyone's goodwill or grief. Alina read it twice. Then she folded it and set it on the windowsill and went back to correcting arithmetic. She heard Thomas come in from the yard an hour later. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. She heard, in the particular quality of the silence that followed, the moment he saw the territorial seal on the envelope. When she came through to start the afternoon lessons, he was gone back outside. He did not come in for lunch. The following morning, Charlie fell from the barn loft. He had been climbing after a cat. This was established immediately, and Will felt it necessary to clarify that he had advised against it, which Charlie disputed, and they were still disputing it when Alina arrived at a dead run from the house, having heard the thud and the shout from the kitchen. Thomas was 30 yards further, coming from the far paddock. Alina reached Charlie first. He was sitting up in the hay, white-faced and winded, more frightened than hurt. She dropped to her knees beside him and ran her hands along his arms and legs with the quick efficiency of someone who had spent years assessing small bodies for damage, and found nothing broken, only a bad bruise forming on his left hip and the shaky breathing of a child who had scared himself. She pulled him into her arms without thinking about it, and he held on with both hands. Thomas arrived at a run and stopped when he saw them. She looked up at him over Charlie's head. His face had shed every careful layer in the 30 seconds of running across the yard, and what was underneath was not the composed rancher or the careful widower, but simply a father who had been terrified, and wasn't quite finished being terrified yet. "He's all right," Alina said quietly. "Bruised, frightened, nothing broken." Thomas crouched down and put his hand on the back of Charlie's head, and Charlie transferred half his grip to his father, and the three of them stayed like that in the hay for a moment that felt longer than it was. Will stood in the loft opening above them. "I told him not to," he said, into the silence. Will, Thomas said. I'm just saying. Will. I'm glad he's okay, Will said in a smaller voice. The next morning, Alina wrote a letter to the territorial school board in Helena, thanked them for their generous offer and declined it. She gave no detailed explanation. She sealed it, handed it to Agnes for the post, and went to start the day's lessons. Agnes held the envelope for a moment. Helena's a fine city, she said, not pushing, just nodding. Yes, Alina agreed. I expect it is. Agnes looked at her for one long moment with those sharp brown eyes that missed nothing and had never pretended to. Then she put the envelope in her apron pocket and went back to the stove. That evening after supper, Thomas found Alina in the sitting room. She was in the rocking chair, Catherine's rocking chair, with her mending in her lap. She had sat in it for the first time 2 nights before, very quietly, testing its weight, and had found that it held her without resistance, as though it had been waiting for someone to simply use it again. Thomas stood in the doorway the way he always did when he had something to say that mattered. She had learned his tells by now. The hat held in both hands, the stillness before the words. You turned down Helena, he said. I did. That was a great deal of money. It was, Alina agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came into the room and sat down in the chair across from her and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and looked at her with the direct gray eyes that had first spoken to her on the platform. Alina, he said, I need to say something, and I'm likely to say it badly, so I'd ask you to hear the whole of it before you respond. She set down her mending. All right. When I came to that platform, he said, I told myself I was there because the boys needed a teacher. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He paused. The whole truth is that I had heard you were coming for 3 weeks, and I had built up some picture of you from Gerald's letters, and when Gerald left I came to that platform because I wanted to see if the picture was right. He stopped again. It wasn't. Alina waited. It was too small, Thomas said. Whatever I had imagined, you were more than it. The first week, watching you with the boys, watching you navigate Agnes, watching you not move Catherine's chair and not make anything into something it didn't need to be. He shook his head. I kept telling myself it was too soon and you deserved better than a grieving man with a complicated household and 4 miles of frozen fence line. He looked at her directly. I can't promise you easy. This life is not easy and I won't dress it up. But Alina, I can promise you that I see you. Not Gerald's intended, not a solution to a problem. You. The woman who read sea stories to my sons until they forgot to argue, and held my boy in a barn without hesitating, and sat down in that rocking chair like you were giving it permission to be a chair again. He got down on one knee on the plank floor, which she had not expected, and which appeared to surprise him slightly as well, as though his knees had made the decision independently. Will you marry me? He said. Not to solve anything, because I don't want to watch you leave. Alina looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket on the train platform, the 30 seconds of panic she had rationed herself, the cold, the trunk, the 2 boys arguing about their own names. She thought about Philadelphia and the 4 years in the drafty schoolroom and the life she had outgrown without knowing it. She thought about a rocking chair that had waited 18 months for someone to simply decide to use it. You didn't finish, she said. Thomas looked uncertain. I didn't. You said, will you marry me, and then you stopped. She picked up her mending again. I said yes somewhere in the middle. You can finish whenever you like. Something happened to Thomas Calloway's face, then that she suspected very few people had ever seen. He laughed, not the polite social sound she had heard at supper, but a real one, startled out of him, and it changed him entirely, took 10 years off the weathered face, and showed her who he had been before the grief had settled in. Yes, he managed. Good, that's yes. From the hallway came the sound of badly suppressed giggling. Alina looked at the door. 2 pairs of boots were visible beneath it. They've been there since you sat down, Thomas said, his voice still unsteady. "I know," Eleanor said. "I heard them." She raised her voice slightly. "You can come in." The door burst open. Both boys erupted into the room, talking simultaneously. "We knew it," Charlie announced. "I knew it first," Will said. "You didn't." "I said it at breakfast." "You said maybe, that doesn't count." "It absolutely." "Boys," Eleanor said. They stopped. "Come here," she said. They came, and she put an arm around each of them, and they leaned into her with the unself-conscious weight of children who have decided, without announcement, that a person is safe. Thomas watched this from the floor, still on one knee, and made no move to get up, and she thought he probably needed another moment and deserved to have it. They were married on the 14th of January in Mercer Flats, in the same church where 60 people had whispered about her in November. The same 60 people were present for the ceremony and considerably louder about it this time, in the better way. The twins stood at the front of the church as witnesses, which had been their own suggestion, and which Thomas had granted on the condition that they behave with some approximation of dignity. They managed this for the duration of the vows and approximately 40 seconds afterward, at which point a disagreement broke out about which of them was standing on the correct side, conducted in urgent whispers that the entire church could hear. Vera Dodd in the front pew put her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders shook. Agnes, 3 rows back, was absolutely not crying. She had something in her eye, both eyes apparently. Eleanor stood at the altar in a gray wool dress she had sewn herself, with Thomas's hand warm around hers, and heard the words she had traveled 3 days on a train to hear spoken to a different man in a different town. The words were the same. Everything else was different. Everything else was better. When Reverend Aldous pronounced them husband and wife and Thomas kissed her, brief, warm, slightly self-conscious with 60 people watching, Will said, clearly audible, finally. Charlie elbowed him. "What?" Will said. "It took forever." The reception was held in the church hall, crowded and warm and loud with fiddle music, and the particular social energy of a frontier community that does not get enough occasions to celebrate and is determined to make the most of this one. Eleanor was passed between conversations like a welcome guest, women who had known Catherine, who spoke of her with love and without apology, who made it plain that Eleanor was not a replacement but an addition, and who had already, without making a production of it, decided she was one of them. Vera Dodd found her near the end of the evening. "Gerald Holt," Vera said, without preamble, "is somewhere in Oregon being deeply sorry about something else by now, I expect." "Very likely," Eleanor said. "His loss," Vera said, with considerable satisfaction. She clinked her cup against Eleanor's and went to find her husband. They rode home in the dark, just the two of them, the boys having fallen asleep in Agnes's wagon ahead of them, and being transported back to the ranch in a tangle of good coats and unconscious limbs. The January sky was extraordinary, clear and bitter cold, the stars so dense and close that Eleanor kept looking up and losing her sense of where the ground was. "You're going to fall off," Thomas said. "I won't," Eleanor said, still looking up. "I have very good balance." "You fell off Opal twice last week." "Those were controlled dismounts." He laughed again. She was collecting his real laughs now, storing them, and reached across the gap between the horses and found her hand, and held it without saying anything. Eleanor held on and looked at the sky and thought about the letter she had been reading when the train pulled into Mercer Flats. Please do not make the journey. She had made the journey anyway, because she had been on the train when the letter arrived, because there was no stopping a train already moving, because sometimes the universe declines to give you the option of retreating to the safe thing. She had not been abandoned on that platform. She had been delivered to it, set down precisely where she was needed, by a chain of small cowardices and missed connections, and a 3-day train ride that had ended exactly where it was supposed to. The ranch house came into view in the valley below, the chimney smoking, the windows lit from inside where Agnes had gone ahead. Home. The word arrived without ceremony, the way true things do, not announced, just suddenly and obviously there. She had come to Montana to marry a man she had never met, to build a life from a newspaper advertisement and a hope. That plan had failed before she stepped off the train. What she had instead was a husband who had gotten down on one knee on a plank floor and told her the truth badly and meant every word of it. Two boys who argued constantly, finished each other's sentences wrong, and had pressed against her sides in a barn and held on. A cook who had negotiated her salary upward without being asked and cried at her wedding with something in both eyes. A rocking chair that had waited for her. A valley in Montana where the sky was so large it reorganized your sense of your own size in the world. Eleanor Marsh had arrived in Mercer Flats with $40 and a letter full of apologies. She rode home as Eleanor Calloway, and the stars above her were innumerable, and the hand holding hers was warm, and somewhere in the wagon ahead 2 boys slept in a heap and would wake up in the morning and argue about who had fallen asleep first.